I think it's a really important conversation because there are so many cultural stories to tell around technology. There's not just one, flattened or narrow kind of understanding of technology that is experienced or known or narrated by absolutely everybody.
I'm your host, Marian Kilgore. Joining me is Kat Jungnickel, a senior lecturer in the sociology department at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her research explores mobilities, gender, technology cultures, maker communities, and visual and inventive methods. She's the author of the recently published book, Bikes and Bloomers, Victorian Women Inventors and Their Extraordinary Cycleware.
And I think you can learn so much from really getting into other kind of stories and often alternate stories by individuals or social groups that might have very different understandings or interpretations of technology and can tell you a lot about how society is changing or where it's come from, and we're replicating similar kind of ideas in different ways.
So in the time period that you researched for your recent book, it was Victorian Britain. And what was sort of the general attitude around bicycles, and how interested were people about bicycles at the time?
Very interested. A cycling craze was sweeping through the nation in the 1890s. It really, it was kind of called the craze and the boom at the time, incredibly exciting. Because while the bicycle had been around for much of the last century in various iterations, it was really the safety bicycle with its evenly matched wheels, very similar to what we ride today, that really captured the imagination of the nation. And, technology was also just a very exciting thing in the 1890s. Lots of, it just was a very inventive time for many different reasons. But it really spoke to this idea of, a modern citizen, about being kind of very progressive and about progress and about the future. So there are lots of ways in which people were adapting and adopting kind of new technologies into their everyday lives. And technology, of course, I speak very broadly about, here we're talking about the bicycle as a new technology, but my research is very much oriented around cycleware, and I think about clothing that equipped different bodies to actually use and ride these new technologies as being technology itself as well.
Why were safety bicycles, the sort of modern two similar wheels as opposed to the penny farthings with the ginormous, hilariously large wheel, why were these getting adopted so vigorously as a technology at the time? I
think because it offered an opportunity for more people to ride these bicycles, rather than the penny farthing, which was really an incredibly kind of daring and dangerous and very exciting bicycle. I actually own two of them, so I know how exciting they can be. But they very much kind of limited the range of people who could be riding and where you could be riding them. So suddenly the kind of safety bicycle emerged, and not only was it kind of a bit easier to ride, but also it became more economically viable for a broader range of people, even though initially it was still very much middle and upper classes. It became easier to kind of store and maintain than you can imagine a high-wheeled bicycle or a high-wheeled tricycle. And it really did, open up lots of kind of practical but also imaginaries about who you could be and where you could go. So it offered such excitement and thrills, but also the opportunity for adventure and independence and freedom of movement, which was particularly important for women. So although, both men and women eagerly kind of took up cycling, they experienced it very differently. And for women, that's why I've been focusing on this story in particular, because I think it really is, provides fascinating insight into the ways in which they creatively and critically responded to what they considered to be restrictions to their freedom of movement in this time of radical kind of technological change. And they certainly didn't want to be left behind.
So anytime we have a technology that suddenly becomes very popular and very ubiquitous, like cell phones or bicycles, there's almost inevitably discussions in popular culture and in the media about what does this mean for social structures? What does this mean for society? How was Victorian England dealing with that aspect of bicycling?
Oh, it was absolutely fascinating. And I think this is why it's kind of captured my imagination for quite a number of years now. So women were very keen cyclists like men, but, society's views about women's bodies, about ideas around feminine mobility in public space, around citizenship were really kind of complicated and highly regulated in relation to women and very differently to men. Because up until kind of the mid-1880s, middle and upper class women's bodies in Victorian society were very much defined by the moral responsibility of the caring and bearing of children and the kind of management and organisation of the household, so very much oriented around the home. They weren't really encouraged into education or business or politics, and very often chaperoned out in public. And even exercise by many medical professionals was deemed unnecessary and even unhealthy for women. Some felt that they should preserve their limited energy resources for these really important reproductive purposes. However, of course, lots of women were really enthusiastic cyclists. But again, kind of their ordinary fashions for middle and upper class women reflected and reproduced a number of these kind of social ideals. They were quite broad, but ostensibly kind of comprised up to 7 pounds of petticoats, long skirts, binding corsets, tight tailored jackets, fitted blouses, veils, and more. And you can imagine, how vastly incompatible this was with the moving machine of a bicycle. So the bicycle really kind of draws attention to these restrictions to women's freedom of movement, not only kind of socially and kind of ideologically, what is the role of women in society, but also materially and physically. So there's so many kind of levels and layers to kind of interrogate this and look at the ways in which women in particular, but lots of people responded to this, because once women had experienced the unparalleled, excitement, freedom and independence of the bicycle, there was kind of no going back. So they had to address what was really considered to be the dress problem, which wasn't just physical, but was also social.
So your book mentions that it's around this time that we also get the drop frame or the ladies' style of bicycle with, instead of the straight bar, the sloping bar. So how did women's participation change bicycle designs, and what did people really think about this, the drop frame style bicycle?
Well, yeah, lots of people, responded to this problem, this issue about women really wanting to cycle and it's quite difficult with the clothing that they were wearing, as well as, socially, how some people were threatened by this idea of the woman out in public doing these kind of new independent things. But just in particular, in relation to the bicycle, of course, many people saw this as a great opportunity to expand the cycling, market. He was a whole new group of people who would buy these machines. So one way of responding to the dress problem was by fixing the bike. So that became the step-through bike, was a way of, keeping some of those flapping materials, out of the way of the wheels, and the dress guard another way, the short-nose saddle, easier for women in lots of, skirts and petticoats to actually mount a bicycle. And of course, to some degrees they worked, but they weren't without their critics. And I do write about this in the book, about how many women were a bit like, hang on, I'm already wearing all of these cumbersome materials while trying to ride a bicycle. And now you've made this bicycle kind of heavier, which was often the case once you've added on chain guards and skirt guards. And many lamented kind of how compromised the ride was when you took away that top bar. It became actually heavier and just not as stiff or responsive as a diamond frame bicycle. So some women were really quite dissatisfied with these adaptations that were made to the bicycle to enable them to ride. And that's why some of them responded to the dress problem by creatively attempting to invent radical new forms of cycle wear.
Yeah, so your book specifically looks at 5 cycling garments that were patented by women in the 1890s. Can you give our listeners an idea of what they were and why you chose those 5 out of all of the patents you ran across?
Yes. Well, after kind of like reading a lot about how women were dissatisfied by their clothes, and this was also, I must say, about a period of time with the dress reformers were really gaining a lot more traction. And dress reformers were really trying to address this problem of women's clothing. And they were, radical dress, again, it comprised a whole range of styles, but it was ostensibly removing this long and layered skirt and petticoats, or shortening it and wearing a pair of bloomers or knickerbockers. And although that was much safer and more comfortable to ride a bicycle, it actually exposed wearers to quite a lot of social violence, verbal or even physical assault, because it really polarized society. Here was a woman that was not only kind of venturing out on her own and into men's kind of lifestyles and privileges, but perchance into their wardrobes as well. So it really identified a woman cyclist and became swiftly this kind of symbol of quite a radical kind of female image, moving around in public space in very different ways. So it really kind of became this symbol of potential kind of social change. And the thing I wanted to say was just some parts of society were threatened by the fact that women were out there carving out new feminine modes of mobility, unchaperoned and at speed, at new times and at new spaces. So, this visual of this woman cycling, and particularly in identifiable cycle wear, became the side of much broader debate about women's role in society. So you had to be quite brave to not only ride a bike, but look like a cyclist. So in the patent archive, there was lots of treasure about how women responded by inventing different forms of cycle wear to enable women to ride their bikes safely and comfortably. But in particular, what I became struck by was a theme which was about convertible cycle wear. And what I found so fascinating about this is that these were garments that ambitiously aimed for both respectable fashion and cycle wear. So it wouldn't give away the fact that you were about to ride your bicycle until you got close to your bicycle, and then you would convert these garments into safe and comfortable cycle wear and then convert them back again. So these inventors engineered technical systems into the very infrastructure of their skirts that enabled wearers to secretly switch from streetwear to cycle wear and back again, which I just found fascinating. And in some ways, these are challenges that many contemporary cyclists are still trying to grapple with. How do you wear something on the bike that works well, but also doesn't really, overtly identify you as a cyclist when you're away from your bicycle? So I found these kind of inventions particularly interesting.
I have to admit that that's part of how I ran across your book, is I was trying to find cycling compatible skirts with pockets that I could also wear in the office.
Exactly.
Which is challenging.
This is a 120-year-old idea. It's not new.
Yeah, so some of these pieces of clothing are quite technical. Could you describe, maybe let's just start with the Bygrave convertible skirt?
Yes. Alice Louisa Bygrave was a dressmaker from, she grew up in Brixton, South London. Brixton, South London, and also lived with her family in, let me say that again. Alice Louisa Bygrave was a dressmaker from London. She grew up in her parents' watch and clock making store in Chelsea, and also lived in Brixton in South London. And she designed, and what's really interesting about the watch and clock making is that she designed a skirt which she felt needed a pulley system sewn into the front and the back inside seams of the skirt, which is really, I think, fascinating considering her kind of upbringing. From the outside, it just looks like a very simple A-line full-length skirt, but on the inside, she's got weights sewn into the hems, stitched channels in the front and the back seams, wax cords, and a series of buttonholes through which these cords are threaded hidden until you get close to your bicycle, and then you pull on these cords and they ruche the front of the skirt up high and out of the way of the wheels, and you do the same for the back. You tie it off and it creates what she was calling a delightful kind of festooning effect, which, to be honest, I had no idea what that meant until I made the skirt and then suddenly went, look at that, it's festooning really nicely over the hips. It really works. It clears the skirt from the wheels. It reveals a little bit of the bloomers underneath, but not too much. And because it was called the Bygrave Quick Change Cycling Skirt and had weights in the hem, as soon as you get off the bike, release the cord, it drops completely down to the ground and conceals what you've been doing or your cycling intentions.
And then there's 4 other ones in your book. Let's talk a little bit about what the Julia Gill's semi-skirt is about.
Julia Gill was a court dressmaker also from London, but North London, and she had an 1895 patent for what she called a cycling costume for ladies, which is a very simple title for a pretty fascinating artifact. Again, an ordinary A-line skirt, but it has this kind of lower flounce. So it has this kind of slightly overlaid double hem. And you look closely at it, and she makes a particular point, which was really interesting when they're reading it, and I didn't really understand why until I'd made it again. The underside of the flounce, she said, should be the same material as the jacket, whereas the rest of the skirt could be a different material. And it was like, oh, that's interesting. Perhaps she's a dressmaker, so she's making a particular kind of like material recommendation. But what happens is when the lady gets close to a bicycle, would reach down to the bottom of the skirt underneath one of these first flounces, and underneath is a ribbon or a cord that's threaded through a series of rings that are very concealed. You gather the skirt up to your waist at that point and tie it at the waist, gathering through these rings with a bow or a knot. And because it has this double flounce, one is tucked under, and the one that is the same material as the jacket remains there and becomes what's called a double peplum, just a double layer that completely matches the jacket and looks like a continued, garment, but it is a shortened one and just becomes a much shorter roll up from the ground up to your knees. So again, it clears the ground incredibly easily, enabling the woman to cycle. She would get off her skirt, release these cords, and what is effectively pretty much, for those who've lived through the 80s fashions, pretty much a bubble skirt. It would then drop straight back down to the ground again.
And then we've got Henrietta Mueller and her 3-piece cycling suit.
She was a fascinating woman to investigate. Some of of course, as per the history of women's inventions, I had to piece together lots of fragmented materials across lots of different archives to try and understand who they were, where they came from, what motivated or influenced them. And some were easier than others. And Frances Henrietta Mueller was certainly one of those, because she was a gentlewoman from Maidenhead out in Berkshire. She was a passionate women's rights activist. She was originally from Chile, but moved to the UK with her family when she was young. But she spoke 6 languages. She was educated in Girton not long after it first opened up to women. She advocated for, of course, women's representation, and kind of refused to pay her tax because she felt she wasn't represented, and was actually arrested for that. She didn't believe that women had enough of a voice in the public sphere, so set up the Women's Herald, the first women's penny paper that employed women to write articles about all sorts of things, not just some kind of women's stories, but just getting a different perspective, and paid them equal wages for equal work. She really was incredibly progressive. And it therefore it doesn't come as any surprise that, because cycling was seen as such an amazing kind of vehicle of women's emancipation, and she saw also this issue of cycle wearers being an opportunity to fit women's bodies, better with this new technology, she also designed a patent for a cycling improvements in ladies' garments for cycling and other purposes in 1896. And this, interestingly enough, out of all the patents I was looking at, is not just for one garment, but it's for three full pieces of an entire cycling suit. Because clearly, Henrietta Muller didn't think you could smash the patriarchy with one skirt. You had to have all three pieces. So it is a three-piece convertible suit made up of a tailored coat, a long, again, A-line skirt. And what's really interesting is she's got an all-in-one undergarment. So she even thought about what women were wearing underneath. You could have a convertible skirt, but what if you're still wearing, a bloomer and, tights and gaiters and a blouse and all sorts of other things. So she even streamlined the bloomer and the blouse into an all-in-one knickerbocker garment, which again looks very contemporary in terms of this period we're living through with onesies, for example. But her long skirt converts in the fact that it has, very simply, loops sewn underneath the hem at different spacings that loop up to buttons that are sewn on the waistband. And so it catches, at the waist, at the front, at the sides and at the back. And then this long three-quarter jacket folds over the top of that, revealing just the edges of your bloomers underneath. Again, a remarkable kind of quick change cycling suit.
And sort of second to last, the one that I found remarkably simple but quite intriguing is the cycling skirt cape combination.
Yes, Mary Elizabeth and Sarah Peace were sisters, again, gentlewomen from Yorkshire, so up north. Their 1896 pattern was for an improved skirt, available also as a cape for lady cyclists. So, yeah, remarkably simple. It's a skirt that also becomes a cape. But I think what they've done, and it's they really brought together a lot of fashions of the period, as well as kind of quite a radical notion of taking the skirt completely away from the body, but enabling it to be put back on again should you feel at all vulnerable, or should you be riding into a place where you might not be particularly sure as to what socially you might be encountering. And they're also, incidentally, the youngest kind of patentees of the period that I was kind of studying. So they're really bringing, this kind of different kind of view on the ways in which, women could be being in or moving through public space. And the fashionable kind of aspect of this is that they, it's the waist of the skirt is quite a wide-waisted, round skirt. They said it should already be like 6 inches from the ground, so already it's a little bit radical in the fact it's shorter and it's a full circular skirt. But then when you take this skirt up away from the waist and you up to your neck, that high waist becomes a high ruched collar cape. So it gathers at the neck, and it's really quite dramatic and quite an impressive kind of garment, even though it's incredibly simple. You could wear it completely wrapped around, or you can flick it very dramatically over your shoulders as well. And they said in the patent that should you desire it not at all on your body, that the cords that are threaded through the waistband could then be used to secure it to your handlebars. So again, just the kind of thought that went into all of these were really, you could discern some of it from reading the patent, but a lot of it really revealed itself to us when we were making and wearing the garments.
Yeah, and we'll link to the project website in the show notes, but where you've described some of the thinking and the prototyping that had to go into your activities to build these skirts, it becomes clear that the patents don't really reveal all of the secrets of how to build these. They're definitely conceptual sort of documents.
Yes, they do provide. I mean, the thing about patents, which was one of the reasons that we made these things, actually there's two main reasons we made the garments. First, there aren't any material examples of these in any of the museums and archives that we've found so far. So one of the first reasons to make them was that we just wanted to see them in action. We wanted to kind of see them up close, to see how they were made, how they were repaired, how they were broken, what that might tell us about the person who wore them, how they were worn, to really kind of interview them. I'm used to interviewing live people, so I just thought, we can at least get the garments and have a chat to them and see what they can tell me about, the people who've lived over a century ago. But we couldn't find any of these materials. There was lots of other kind of women's sportswear in museums and galleries, and I found those incredibly fascinating to get up close to, but I couldn't find any of these. And there's lots of reasons for why they're not there. First of all, cycle wear, as many of us who cycle know, gets worn out, and very rarely do you look at your old kind of cycling nicks and think the National Gallery needs those once I'm done with them. So there's certainly a way in which they're potentially not seen as very valuable. As per gendered norms of the time, women's invention hasn't been seen as very valuable in the past, so there's also just not recognizing that. And the fact that these women were deliberately concealing these technologies underneath, in the very infrastructure of dresses. In some cases, you could say they did their job so well that you don't really know the treasure that you have unless you're specifically looking for it. And we were just wanting to see these in action. How did they enable or constrain bodies in different ways? How did they actually work? And even if they'd been in museums and galleries, the chances of anyone, a lovely curator, letting me put one of these on and go for a ride, very, very unlikely. And to be honest, my 2018 female frame is not going to fit into an 1890s cycling costume. I'm quite committed to this project, but I've not been wearing a corset for it. So lots of reasons to make them, and of course the patterns are they're fascinating design objects because they really they get us closer to the people that have lived in the past, because they provide not only descriptions of the inventor, what she was concerned with or worried about at the time, what the problem was that she was attempting to solve and her solution, who she was designing for, the materials, the technologies to use, where they'd be used. Like, they really provide insightful glimpses into the socio-cultural context of the time. But they also provide step-by-step instructions for future users to replicate their ideas. So we figured, we've got these instructions, why not make some? So we followed their step-by-step instructions, made a lot of mistakes along the way, because yes, there's certainly a lot of kind of leaps that you have to make. Sometimes it's about that kind of historic language. Sometimes it's about materials or processes that we don't have or don't really understand. But also, I think, there's a lot of interpretation that can take place. And there's no way that I'm saying what we've done is the perfect, exact iteration, but rather we've attempted to make them. And in the process, we've really come to understand some of the incredible complexity and nuance and detail in these designs, and the fact that they really did work. And I think that's, an amazing thing when you're just reading something to then actually make it, put it on, transform it on your own body. There's an absolute delight in that. And I see that whenever I'm performing in costume and show people as well, these garments transforming. And they really must have, not only do they kind of delight contemporary audiences, but at the time they must have really just provided this new, exciting imaginary for women about who they could be in public and how they could have different choices about being in and moving through public space with new technologies. Yeah,
so the last skirt we haven't described is the Hyde Park safety skirt. And then I'd like to get into a discussion about why clothing is a technology. Because it's so commonplace that I think it's easy to forget that it is. And especially these designs.
Yeah, so the Mary Ann Ward patent, she was very aligned to the kind of dress reform community and also the cycling community, and lived out in Bristol. And she lodged an 1897 patent for improvements in ladies' skirts for cycling, but it was kind of more colloquially known as the Hyde Park safety skirt. And the reason that we know about this is that it was written about by Lady Harberton, who was one of the leaders of the Rational Dress Society, and she wrote about it in correspondence with the committee of key people within the community, and also wrote about it in the Rational Dress Gazette. So it was a really interesting, I think, artifact, like many of these, that seem to offer this kind of middle ground between people who really wanted to cycle but just felt it was incredibly dangerous to be riding in kind of conventional, ordinary women's clothing, but perhaps weren't completely for many reasons, weren't able to wear, the full kind of rational dress, kind of bloomer suit in public. But this became a way of inhabiting this ground between the two, and enabling women to still engage in these new, mobile technologies and public space in a new way. But it also speaks to, I think, I read a lot more about, these public spaces like Hyde Park and how lots of people would go to them to ride their bicycles, showing off not only kind of the cultural cachet of having a bicycle and a new cycling suit and the leisure time to enjoy it, but also just engaging kind of, so socially, and how wonderful it was to be riding with lots of people in these new spaces, having these kind of new conversations with new technologies, and experiencing public space in a different way.
So the technology of clothing.
Oh, do you know what I haven't done? I haven't even explained what that skirt was. Should I tell you?
Yes, we should do that.
Yeah. So the Mary Ann Ward's skirt, again, was an A-line full-length skirt, very simple, but this time it has 2 rows of buttons running down both seams on the side of the skirt. And it had these waist straps, which were hidden inside until the wearer revealed them. And they had buttonholes on them, but they had fewer buttonholes than the buttons on the side of the skirt. So the idea was that you would just tether these straps to every second button or every third button, depending on how high you wanted to raise the skirt from the ground. And again, it does kind of a similar kind of festooning or ruching effect to the Alice Bygrave convertible skirt, but it does it at the sides. And I think possibly it became this kind of Hyde Park safety skirt because it wasn't as kind of like dramatically transformative like the Julia Gill skirt, for example, that turned into this kind of high bubble skirt, but rather you could kind of catch these buttons quite subtly by the side of the road, for example, without revealing too much of anything. But it still cleared the skirt from the wheels and looked quite attractive while it was converted. And again, you could drop it quite easily when you got off the bicycle. So again, another kind of really simple but really kind of thoughtful invention that's been put into a very kind of ordinary skirt.
Clothing as a technology, why is it important to think of it in that way?
Clothing, I think, is a really fascinating and ordinary, yet also, let me say that again. Clothing is a very mundane and ordinary, yet also fascinating artifact for understanding complex ideas about the changing nature of gender relations, about new technologies, about politics, and ideas around kind of public space and mobility and citizenship and more. And I think psychwear in particular provides a really interesting lens into all of these things. It's a really fascinating barometer of social and cultural change. And as a sociologist, I'm quite new to looking at clothing. I hadn't really done much of it until I was doing contemporary cycle research, and I was talking to people about, the cultures of cycling where they were living, and they kept on talking about what they were wearing. And I was a bit like, no, I want to hear about infrastructure, or I want to hear about policy. And cycleware just kept on coming up, and it kept on being related to all of these things. And women in particular would talk about how what they wore sometimes elicited unwelcome responses from fellow road users, how in some cases looking like a proper cyclist enabled them to carve out legitimate space on the road, how in other cases it didn't, or they were constantly kind of trying to find appropriate cyclewear, or had to hack or remake kind of cyclewear because they felt like men had more range and certainly kind of higher technical spec clothing than they did. So it just seemed like it was something that was, again, this kind of creative and critical artifact that took a lot of focus for cyclists, and you could use that as a lens to kind of talk about all sorts of other things. So I started to think about cyclewear as this socio-technology that enables, constrains, and organizes bodies in different ways. You know, it kind of gives permission to people to do different things, and also becomes a catalyst to adapt or remix or remake things in order to do the things that you want. And so by researching, for me, how early cyclists made their bodies mobile, how they made their bodies fit with these new technologies, and particularly for women who really didn't fit socially or materially at the time, reveals a lot about these social and physical barriers that they were navigating and pressing against and reconfiguring, and also, you know, really reveals fascinating, lesser-known tales of ingenious inventors and inventions that took place at the time.
So you mentioned that you had difficulty finding examples of these garments in the archives. How does that reflect on how technologies can be hidden and more difficult to find in histories, or garments in particular, I guess?
I think garments in particular, of course, get used, and so they can disappear a lot more easily, and particularly the garments that are well used, such as cyclewear. You know, many of us are aware of how, you know, garments, you know, develop holes quite quickly and actually kind of disappear from use, and I think that's a very practical reason as to why they're not there. But in this case of women's kind of inventive forms of cyclewear, you know, there are many other reasons, some of them kind of a little bit more political, as to why they're not in these kind of histories. You know, there are kind of issues about the fact that, you know, women's kind of invention hasn't been kind of highly valued as per gendered norms of the time, so haven't been kind of recognized as being the kind of incredibly important artifacts that they are for, you know, catalyzing, you know, significant kind of social change, and so they haven't kind of been put into our archives in that way. Or, as is the case, you know, many of these may have either not been just systematically erased, there may have just been elements of them forgotten, such as, you know, these are garments that you don't really know what you've got unless you're looking for them and you've associated with some of the stories. So as I've said about some of these inventions, they're quite, you know, subtle and yet still transformative, but you've got to know where those, you know, hooks go on these different buttons, or how these cords thread through certain things. So in piecing together, for me, you know, these stories and these fragments across these archives with these women's patterns and making the garments help to kind of piece together, you know, some of these stories that otherwise are incredibly kind of dispersed throughout the archives. And I think that is not only kind of, you know, a practical problem, but it's been a political thing about just not considering these as being particularly important. And I think, you know, what I think another issue about this is the fact that women have tended to be kind of cast as partial actors in many historical narratives, and that's partially why their stories are kind of everywhere or not everywhere. So, or they've actually been kind of systematically written out of the records. You know, they've often been narrated as being caught up in kind of waves of technical change as like symbols of social upheaval, not catalysts of it. So they've never really been the kind of drivers of these stories. So I think what my research has been kind of highlighting is the important role that women have played in the early cycling and technical cultures, not as passive or ornamental bystanders, but as engineers and as designers and as radical feminist inventors. You know, this research really depicts women as being critically engaged, creative citizens, actively driving social and technical change and using their radical garments, their patterns, and their differently clad bodies and to really push against, you know, these restrictions to their freedom of movement, you know, these kind of established forms of gendered citizenship and the stigma of urban harassment. So claiming their designs not only through the making of these garments and putting, you know, different bodies, their own bodies into them in public space, but also through patenting became a very political act. And I think that's what I've been trying to kind of bring back out of these archives as kind of also a political act about reclaiming a lot of these feminist histories that otherwise have and easily kind of go unnoticed.
So you mentioned that what's in the archives is definitely to a certain extent a political and a social aspect. Do you have any speculation on other aspects of the history of technology that we might just be missing out on because no one thought to save it?
Yes, lots. I think from this work, what I kept on doing was like, well, how do we not know about these amazing inventions, you know, and how many other kind of amazing inventions don't we know about? You know, we should be asking, how do we ask different questions, you know, about our histories of technology and cycling? You know, how do we investigate the archives in different ways? You know, how do we kind of really engage with the gaps in these stories and fill them perhaps by pulling together a lot of these different fragments in different places. So yes, I was just kept on asking these questions and trying to encourage more people to ask them about what else don't we know and how do we look for stories that in a way are less loud or triumphal or kind of easier to get access to, you know, that are perhaps more hidden in plain sight, which is what these ones are.
So you mentioned earlier on about the middle and upper class women. How does that aspect of the social classes, especially at the time, affect what you were able to research?
Yes, I'm glad you raised this because I make a real point in the fact that the book is primarily about middle and upper class women because they were really at the cutting edge of fashion. They had the money to embrace, you know, new technologies like the bicycle. They had exposure to a whole range of new information such as media and ideas from travelers from new worlds. And they also had, importantly, the social and kind of the cultural capital to push against conventional social codes and norms about how women were meant to be in and act in public. And so they were really doing things that were causing, you know, ripples and discussion and lots of debate. And this is certainly not saying that lots of other women in kind of lower, you know, lower middle and working classes weren't also doing this. There were certainly lots of women who were very physically active and some who were wearing menswear such as, you know, in more fishing or mining or other kinds of kind of industrial work for a very long time. However, they were differently visible in the public sphere. They were more likely invisible in those kind of actions. So I was really focusing at this point, even though there are amazing other stories to tell and to reclaim, but I was particularly focusing on this group who were causing kind of quite a lot of discombobulation in social and political spheres in relation to invention and clothing and cycling.
Changing tacks just a little bit, you mentioned, we've mentioned sort of throughout the interview that these were patented designs. So why were women patenting much in the decades previous to this? And how does that sort of also talk about technology and the embrace of technology at the time? Or is that too many questions?
No, that's good. You just made me think of something else as well that I'd like to say about patents are pivotal in the story because they're a permanent record of this delicate and material object. Mm. Can I say a bit more about that?
Yes, go for it.
And then I definitely want to answer that question. But I just think this answers a bit more about what you were just asking about, what isn't in our archives. So patents are really pivotal in this story because they're a permanent record of a very kind of delicate and, in a way, ephemeral, material artifact. They really get us closer to people who lived over a century ago, what kind of concerned them, what they were interested in, what problems they saw that they could potentially kind of solve, and their solutions. And what I find really interesting about them is that they draw on the past to make claims on the present and imagine different futures. So they operate on these multiple different dimensions. And I think what's particularly good in terms of thinking about what's in and not in archives is that patent archives provide a really good record of women's inventions and inventiveness in ways that doesn't always emerge in other kind of like narrative accounts in our technology and cycling histories. They really give voice to a group often absent or silenced in the histories of technology, and they're continuous. The patent archives really show that women have been inventive for a very long period of time and continuously, this is evidence of women continuously being creative inventors and continual kind of contributors to business and industry, even when what they've been doing has been undervalued or written out of other historic narratives. So in terms of kind of just, the patenting period, the mid-1890s is a remarkable period, not only marked by a boom in cycling, but also a boom in patenting. Patent applications were growing steadily in the early 1890s, but there's a really remarkably big jump in about 1895, 1896, at the height of the cycling boom, just over 20% kind of increase in patents, and primarily they were due to cycling inventions, and not only by men. This is a remarkable time of inventiveness, especially for and by women. Up until this time, women weren't really recognized as being inventors in any of the kind of annual patent records that were written in the patent office. And then they suddenly became kind of statistically relevant in the 1890s. And there's a number of factors for this. First of all, there was a Married Women's Property Act that came into force in the 1870s, but it wasn't until the 1880s that this included a women's right to legally own property in their own names. And of course, women had been responsible for many innovations up until this time, but they were presumably women were recognized for many innovations up until this time, but they were either not recognized or were claimed by men in their lives. And also there was a Patent Reform Act that was passed in the 1880s as well, with the just primary aim of making the patenting process much more simple, to enable many more people to patent ideas, to make it cheaper and faster and easier. So you didn't just have to be rich or really connected or have a patron in order to kind of patent an idea. You could actually be, someone who happened to have a good idea and a small amount of money, and you could actually then go and make a claim on it. So this, combined with this excitement around cycling in the 1890s, really fueled this Victorian inventive spirit. And so much so that cycling for women, and particularly cyclewear, became one of kind of the primary vehicles with which they kind of entered into the world of patenting at this time.
So did any of the women make money from their patents?
Yes. Alice Bygrave, the dressmaker from Brixton, must have known she was onto something pretty amazing, because she not only patented her Bygrave quick change convertible skirt in Britain in 1895, but she also patented it in the US, in Canada, and in Switzerland not long afterwards. So she had 4 patents for this similar idea. And one of the things that's really hard to do when you're kind of tracing inventions in the archives is to keep a hold on it when it gets picked up and commercialized, because very often it gets renamed as something else, and very easily you hit a dead end in your research. But this is not the case with Alice, because Jaeger, the British fashion house, which is still in existence today, saw great potential in this and called it the Bygrave Quick Change Convertible Skirt and promoted it all around the UK, in England and in Scotland. It was also sold in Australia, in Sydney and in Melbourne.
You went through and constructed these skirts. I mean, particularly the Bygrave convertible skirt. It has pulleys. It has weights. I'm an engineer. I found this thoroughly entertaining. So how complicated was that one to build?
Quite complicated. We had to do so many different iterations of that. We drew pictures of it first of all. We made small-scale models of it in material and paper clips and staples and things. Then we made full-sized mock-ups. Full-size toiles in a light kind of calico material. Then we made a garment out of a full scale, but in a kind of similar weighted wool. And then we made the final garment. So we had many iterations of many of these, but that was perhaps one of the most complicated ones.
And you mentioned earlier about sort of interviewing the garments. So what does the act of constructing and wearing these garments, how does that help the research and the understanding of the technologies at the time and the social structures around them?
Well, I started to really look at patents as experiments in problem solving, and by actually engaging directly in that, we were also doing what I think the inventors were doing as well. So we were actually replicating a lot of their processes because they describe the problems they're attempting to solve and their solutions in careful and visual details. And one way to understand that is, of course, through analysis of the text and images. Another is to follow their step-by-step instructions to replicate their ideas. And there's a long history of doing this in the history of, and this approach in social sciences, in the history of technology and food sciences. Some people cook from archives. Some people reconstruct iconic experiments, such as like Faraday experiments. And really what it shows is that you can learn a lot through making that differs to just reading a document. Because you spend, and particularly because these are garments, you spend time with and also in the garments. Like our bodies were really important in all of this. We're constantly putting these things on in order to make them work because they really don't work well off the body. The body is needed. Arms and waists and legs are needed in order for these things to actually work. And I found that we were developing understandings through practice, through these iterations, through the mistakes and the tangents throughout that process that otherwise I don't think would have been so discernible from just, engaging with these things from more of a surface level. And also fundamentally because these inventions are articles of clothing, they're designed to work with and on the body. So by making and wearing the garments, we started to think about them as kind of dynamic three-dimensional arguments that we could then investigate the patterns in very different ways. So that's how I was thinking about interviewing them. I was just like, well, what is happening here? Why is this happening here? What else could be happening here? What is emerging? Even we started to answer questions we didn't even know to ask, I think, which is one of the really wonderful things about doing this kind of practice work. You really end up sometimes very different places than you expect.
One of the things that gets mentioned in your book that I wanted to talk about since we've got a little bit of time, and anyone who regularly wears men's clothing is probably going to wonder why I'm making a big deal out of this, but what were pockets like at the time? And how were pockets changing?
Pockets are fascinating political and gendered objects, and they have been for a very long time. Although small and mundane and easily overlooked, they play a really important role in the construction of mobile bodies and in gender relations. And so pockets are moreover their absence, even in kind of contemporary women's fashion, have long held, powerful practical and symbolic value. They speak to roles and responsibility and to power relations. Men's pockets are often on show and have been regularly on show, and they're as symbols of power and of property. But for women, they're more often hidden or absent. Women have more often been considered property themselves rather than having the capacity to own property. So the number of pockets, and lots of people have written about the history of pockets, at different periods of time, but I've been looking at them particularly in kind of the 1890s, partially because my patentees talk about them quite a lot, and they emerge in a lot of the discussions that the dress reformers were having and the women's rights emancipists were having, just about the increasing kind of mobility and independence of women really speak to the importance and role of pockets in their clothing. They become particularly critical in periods of increased mobility and independence, such as around the introduction of new mobility technologies like the bicycle. So we can tell a lot about changing ideas of society by examining, who has pockets, where they are, the kinds of pockets, and what kind of inventions they inspired. So the patent archive is filled with a lot of pocket patents over the last century, and they really do speak to the problems that people were identifying and how they saw pockets as solving a lot of those.
Wait, like patents specifically for pocket designs?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Pocket patents, yes, throughout the archive.
Oh my! What sort of inventions were happening in the pocket world then?
Well, there's lots of pockets around new mobility clothing, for cycling, for, catching trains and boats. Around the turn of the century, there's a lot of discussion around pockets in relation to pickpocketing or trying to prevent it. So, these issues around sociality in public space and mass industrialization meant that more people were in closer proximity in public space. So the middle and upper classes were, pickpocketing was rife. And so there's a lot of patents to prevent pickpocketing for both men and women's clothes that were, there's all sorts of ways of doing that, but there might be about the way in which you would sew a pocket that has a particular kind of entry point that only the wearer can gain access, not a little hand from a different direction, or they might have little snap enclosures that you would prevent some hand from going into it, or perhaps just snap on that hand, and different locking mechanisms. Around the wars, for example, pockets become important in terms of combination clothing, kind of preparing citizens for scarcity of materials and the unknown. There's also lots of pockets that have been designed and redesigned about new digital technologies. Most recently, I think there's just a lot of clothes that have, pockets kind of added to them so you can carry your mobile phone. But more recently, pockets have been addressing concerns about radiation emitting from these kind of technologies. So how do you build a pocket that actually prevents you from the threat of the technology as opposed to the threat of things outside of the body? So I think they really bring to light around ideas around, different mobilities, about fears or the promise or the threat of new technologies, and they kind of signal different ideas around safety and danger in public space and bodies. So pocket patents are really kind of fascinating.
Huh. I had no idea that there were patents specific for pockets, but I guess even today you think about things like passports and credit cards with chips in them, and, I have a pocket for my passport that blocks RFID and all those sorts of things as well.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Pockets are, I think it's when you look at the mundane technologies, and a pocket is a technology of carrying things, but also protecting in different ways. It can really provide insights into the things that we think are important or we're fearful of, or that we want to change or imagine different ways of being.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and for your time and the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking about all of this with you.
You can learn more about Dr. Jungnickel and find links to information about the Bikes and Bloomers research and her other research at our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. There you can also find past episodes, our social media links, and learn how to support the show.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.